She was 8 months pregnant when she saw him, her husband, sitting in the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, his hand resting on another woman's thigh. But here is what he did not expect. His pregnant wife was not home crying. She was not waiting by the phone like a good little housewife. No, she was sitting 20 feet away, dining with the one man in New York City who could destroy everything Richard Holloway had ever built. And she had planned every single moment of this night. What happens next is not just a story about revenge. It is a masterclass in survival. This woman lost everything: her career, her money, her family. Her own parents believed she was mentally unstable because her husband told them she was crazy. She had no lawyer, no allies, no way out. Until she remembered who she was before she became his wife. She was a fighter, and fighters do not stay down. By the end of this story, you will watch a broken woman rise from the ashes and burn her cheating husband's empire to the ground, all while giving birth to her daughter. This is not fiction, this is war, and she won. Value statement. This is more than entertainment. Inside these next 100 minutes, you will discover how controlling partners isolate their victims, the warning signs most women miss, until it is too late, and most importantly, the exact strategies one woman used to escape a seemingly hopeless situation. If you or someone you love has ever felt trapped in a relationship, this story might change everything. Meaning of the story: this story proves one unshakable truth. Your worst moment is not your final chapter. The same intelligence that someone used against you can become your greatest weapon. And sometimes, the woman they underestimated becomes the one who writes the ending. The afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the $15 million Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the Italian marble floors. Margaret Holloway, known to everyone as Maggie, stood at the kitchen island arranging white peonies in a crystal vase. At 34 years old and 8 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand occasionally resting on the swell of her belly. Today was her husband's 40th birthday, and she had spent the entire morning preparing his favorite meal: beef Wellington with a red wine reduction, roasted fingerling potatoes, and a chocolate souffle that had taken 3 attempts to perfect. She talked to her unborn daughter as she worked, a habit she had developed in the lonely months of her pregnancy. "Your daddy is turning 40 today, sweetheart. I made his favorite dish. The same one I made on our first anniversary when we could barely afford our tiny studio apartment in Queens. Back then, I burned the pastry and we laughed about it for hours." He said it was the best meal he had ever eaten. Maggie smiled at the memory, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. That was before the penthouse, before the private drivers and the charity galas and the life that looked so perfect from the outside. Before she became Mrs. Richard Holloway, wife of one of Manhattan's most successful real estate developers. Before she stopped being Maggie, her mother's voice echoed in her mind, words spoken at her bridal shower 7 years ago. "Never lose yourself in someone else's story, Margaret. A woman who forgets her own name eventually forgets her own worth." Maggie had laughed it off then. She was madly in love with a man who promised her the world. She thought she was building their story together, a partnership of equals, a love that would only grow stronger with time. She did not realize she was slowly disappearing. The transformation had happened so gradually that she barely noticed it. First, it was leaving her job as a litigation attorney at one of the city's most prestigious firms. Richard had been so concerned about her stress levels, so worried about the long hours and the toll it was taking on her health. "You are too talented to waste your life in courtrooms," he had told her, his hand caressing her cheek. Let me take care of you. Let me give you the life you deserve. Then it was moving away from Brooklyn, where her friends and family lived, to this sterile palace in the sky. Better schools nearby, he had explained, even though they did not have children yet. Better security. Better everything. One by one, her friendships faded. "Those people are jealous of us," Richard would say whenever she mentioned missing her old life. "They do not understand our world." And Maggie, desperate to believe in the fairy tale she had married into, agreed. She let go of her career, her friends, her independence. She became exactly what Richard wanted, a beautiful accessory in his carefully curated life. The baby kicked, pulling Maggie from her thoughts. She placed both hands on her belly and felt the movement, strong and insistent. "I know, little one. Mommy is being melancholy. But tonight is going to be special. Daddy and I are going to have a romantic dinner, just the two of us. Maybe things will feel like they used to." She had been holding on to that hope for months now. The hope that once the baby arrived, Richard would change, that he would be present again, attentive, the man she had fallen in love with, that the distance she felt between them was just temporary, just the stress of his work and her pregnancy hormones playing tricks on her mind. The sound of the front door opening made her heart leap. Richard Holloway strode into the penthouse like he owned the world, which, in many ways, he did. At 40 years old, he was still devastatingly handsome. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could charm anyone in the room. He was the kind of man who made you feel like the only person who mattered. Until you stopped being useful. "Smells amazing, Mags," he said, loosening his tie as he walked toward her. He kissed her forehead briefly, his lips barely brushing her skin. "But listen, change of plans. Client dinner tonight. Cannot be helped. Rain check on the birthday thing." Maggie felt something crack inside her chest. "Richard, I have been cooking all day. The beef Wellington, your favorite. I even made the chocolate souffle." He was already walking toward the bedroom, his phone in his hand, his attention elsewhere. I know, and it is sweet, really. But this client is flying in from Dubai. Huge deal on the line. You understand?" She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the crystal vase against the wall and watch it shatter into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to demand that he look at her, really look at her, and see the woman who had given up everything for him. Instead, she heard herself say, "Of course, business comes first." Richard paused at the bedroom door and turned back to her. That smile again, the one that used to make her knees weak. "You are the best, Mags. Seriously, we will celebrate this weekend, I promise. Maybe that new French place you have been wanting to try." Then he was gone, the bedroom door closing behind him. Maggie stood alone in the massive kitchen, surrounded by food that would never be eaten, flowers that suddenly seemed garish and desperate. The baby kicked again, harder this time. "I know, sweetheart," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your daddy is an idiot, but we love him anyway." She paused, waiting. Another kick. "Okay, maybe love is a strong word right now." An hour later, Richard emerged in a fresh suit, smelling of expensive cologne. He grabbed his keys from the console table by the door and called out a casual goodbye without looking back. The door closed. The elevator chimed, and Maggie was alone again in the penthouse that had become her prison. She looked at the beef Wellington cooling on the counter, at the carefully set table for two, at the candles she had planned to light. Then she picked up her phone and ordered takeout from the Thai place around the corner, the same place she used to order from in her old apartment, back when she was still Maggie the lawyer, Maggie the fighter, Maggie who did not need anyone to complete her. She ate pad thai on the couch in her sweatpants, watching reality television and pretending that her life was not falling apart. The baby kicked one more time, gentle now, almost sympathetic. "It is okay. Maggie said, stroking her belly. Mommy is okay. We are going to be okay. But even as she said the words, she was not sure she believed them anymore. 3 days later, Maggie found herself doing something Richard had explicitly told her never to do. She was cleaning his home office. It started innocently enough. She was looking for the ultrasound photo from their 20-week appointment, the one that showed their daughter's perfect profile. She wanted to frame it as a surprise for the nursery, a gift for Richard to remind him of what truly mattered. The office was Richard's sanctuary, a room of dark wood and leather furniture that smelled of cigars and ambition. Maggie rarely entered it, respecting the boundary he had established early in their marriage. My office is where I become the man who provides for this family, he had explained. I need it to be exactly the way I want it. But today, with Richard at work and the housekeeper on vacation, Maggie convinced herself it was fine. She was just looking for a photo. How long could it take? The ultrasound was in the second drawer of his desk, tucked inside a manila folder labeled Personal. Maggie pulled it out and smiled at the image of her daughter, perfect and whole, floating in the darkness of her womb. Then she saw what was underneath, a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in the financial district. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the Hudson River. Monthly rent of $12,000. The tenant's name was Tiffany Blake. Maggie's hands began to shake. She told herself there was an explanation. Maybe Tiffany was a client. Maybe this was a corporate apartment for visiting executives. Maybe Richard was helping a family member she had never met. But her fingers kept moving, pulling out more documents. Credit card statements with charges at jewelry stores, lingerie boutiques, upscale restaurants. All places Richard had never taken her. Then she found the photographs. They were printed on the glossy paper, the kind you get from a professional photo service. Richard and a young blonde woman on a beach, the Maldives, based on the distinctive overwater bungalows in the background. The same week he had told Maggie he was at a finance conference in Singapore. In one photo, the woman was laughing, her head thrown back, Richard's arm wrapped possessively around her waist. In another, they were kissing, silhouetted against a sunset that looked like it belonged in a travel magazine. In a third, she was wearing his shirt, only his shirt. Maggie made it to the bathroom before she vomited. She knelt on the cold tile floor, her pregnant belly pressing against the cabinet, and emptied the contents of her stomach until there was nothing left. Then she sat back, gasping, tears streaming down her face. No, 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 no. The words came out in a chant, a desperate prayer to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. This cannot be happening. I gave up everything. My career, my friends, my identity. I gave him everything, and he. She could not finish the sentence. The panic attack hit her like a freight train. Suddenly she could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but gasp for air that would not come. Her chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint of light. The baby. Oh God, the baby. With shaking hands, Maggie reached for her phone and dialed 911. I need help, she managed to say between gasps. I am pregnant. I cannot breathe. I think something is wrong. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. They found her curled on the bathroom floor, still clutching the photograph of her husband and his mistress. The EMT, a kind-faced woman named Rosa, took one look at the photo and understood. Honey, she said gently, prying the picture from Maggie's fingers. You are having a panic attack. Your baby is okay. You are okay. But we need to get you to the hospital to make sure. At Mount Sinai, they hooked her up to monitors and gave her something to calm her nerves. A doctor explained that extreme stress could trigger early labor, especially in the 3rd trimester. They wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Maggie lay in the hospital bed, alone in a room that smelled of antiseptic and despair, and stared at the ceiling. The evidence was undeniable. Her husband, the father of her unborn child, had been having an affair. For how long, she did not know, but the apartment lease was dated 18 months ago, which meant this had been going on for at least a year and a half. Their entire pregnancy. Every prenatal appointment he had missed because of work. Every weekend trip he had taken for business. Every late night at the office. Lies. All of it. The worst part was not the betrayal itself. It was realizing how blind she had been. How willfully, desperately blind. All the signs had been there. The perfume on his collar that was not hers. The phone calls he took in another room. The way he looked at her sometimes, like she was a problem to be managed rather than a wife to be loved. She had seen it all, and she had chosen not to see. A nurse came in to check her vitals, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a warm smile. "How are you feeling, honey?" Maggie laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the sterile room. "I just found out my husband is cheating on me. I am 8 months pregnant, and I have no idea what to do." The nurse paused, her hand resting on Maggie's arm. "Can I give you some advice from someone who has seen this more times than I can count?" Maggie nodded. "Document everything. Dates, times, evidence, whatever you found. Make copies. Store them somewhere he cannot access. Your future self will thank you." Maggie looked at the nurse, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes. Recognition, solidarity, the shared experience of women who had been where Maggie was now. "You have been through this," Maggie said. It was not a question. The nurse smiled sadly. 15 years ago. And I wish someone had told me what I just told you. It would have saved me a lot of heartache." After the nurse left, Maggie reached for her phone. With trembling fingers, she created a new email account using her maiden name. Then she began typing everything she remembered. The apartment address, the dates on the lease, the credit card charges, the photographs. She did not know yet what she would do with this information. She did not know if she would confront Richard or file for divorce or try to work things out. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not be caught unprepared. Not again, not ever. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, as if to say, "Good. Fight back, I will, sweetheart," Maggie whispered into the darkness. "I promise you, I will." 1 week later, Maggie sat in a sleek conference room in Midtown Manhattan, across from her former law school roommate, Diana Wells. Diana had become one of the city's most successful divorce attorneys, known for her surgical precision in high-asset cases and her absolute lack of sentimentality. She did not handle breakups. She orchestrated the systematic dissolution of marriages, extracting maximum value for her clients while leaving their opponents financially and emotionally devastated. They had not spoken in almost 3 years. Richard had never liked Diana, calling her aggressive and unfeminine and a bad influence. Maggie, eager to please her husband, had let the friendship fade. Now, sitting in Diana's office, with a folder full of evidence on the table between them, Maggie felt the shame of that choice burning in her chest. Diana leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the documents Maggie had compiled. "So let me get this straight," Diana said. "He convinced you to quit being a lawyer, moved you away from everyone who cared about you, and has been cheating on you for at least 18 months, all while you were pregnant with his child." Maggie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Diana shook her head, slowly. "That is not a husband, Maggie. That is a Bond villain with commitment issues." Despite everything, Maggie felt a small laugh escape her lips. The first real laugh in days. I know. I know. I was so stupid. Diana's expression softened. She reached across the table and took Maggie's hand. Hey, you were not stupid. You were in love. Those are not the same thing. Stupid would be staying now that you know the truth. You are here. That is brave. The kindness in Diana's voice nearly broke Maggie. She had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, but Diana's compassion threatened to undo all of it. I do not know what to do, Maggie admitted. I do not have access to any money. The prenup I signed is ironclad. He has all the power and I have nothing. Diana's eyes hardened. That is exactly what he wants you to think. And yes, your situation is complicated. But complicated is not the same as hopeless. She pulled out a legal pad and began to write. First, the bad news. Richard has spent years preparing for this moment. He transferred most of your marital assets into a trust that you cannot touch without his consent. The prenuptial agreement you signed, which I am guessing you did not have independently reviewed. I trusted him, Maggie said quietly. Diana nodded without judgment. Of course you did. He was your husband. But that prenup is designed to leave you with minimal assets in case of divorce. And because you have been out of the workforce for 5 years, a court might view you as voluntarily underemployed. He could argue that you are capable of supporting yourself and therefore do not need significant alimony. Maggie's stomach dropped. What about custody? Diana hesitated. This is where it gets really complicated. Richard has resources you do not. He can afford the best lawyers, the best experts, the best everything. If you file for divorce now, he will fight you on custody, not because he wants to be a father, but because he knows it is your pressure point. He would use our daughter as a weapon, Maggie said. Diana met her eyes. Men like Richard always do. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. So what do I do? Maggie asked. Just accept it. Let him win? Absolutely not, Diana said. You are going to fight, but you are going to fight smart. You need leverage, Maggie. Real leverage. Something that will make Richard want to give you a fair settlement rather than risk a prolonged legal battle. Where am I supposed to find leverage against a man who has spent years hiding his assets? Diana smiled, a sharp expression that reminded Maggie why they had been friends in the first place. There is someone I want you to meet. His name is James Thornton. He is a forensic accountant who specializes in finding money that people do not want found. Maggie's eyes widened. James Thornton? The one who took down Senator Morrison? The very same. He owes me a favor from a case we worked together years ago. But I have to warn you, Maggie, he is expensive and he is difficult. He has a rule that he only takes cases where the spouse has been genuinely wronged. He will want to vet you first. What does that mean? Diana leaned forward. It means he will look into your background, your marriage, your character. James does not just find hidden money, he builds cases. And he only builds cases for people he believes in. Maggie thought about the woman she used to be, the fierce attorney who had graduated top of her class from Columbia Law, the woman who had won impossible cases through preparation and determination and sheer refusal to quit. That woman was still inside her somewhere, buried under years of Richard's subtle manipulation, but still alive. Set up the meeting, Maggie said. I am ready. Diana nodded approvingly. There is one more thing you need to understand. From this moment forward, you cannot let Richard know that anything has changed. If he suspects you are investigating him, he will move assets, destroy evidence, and make your life a living hell. Can you do that, Maggie? Can you look at the man who betrayed you and pretend everything is normal? It was a terrifying question. The idea of going home to Richard, sleeping beside him, smiling at him across the breakfast table, while knowing what she now knew. But then Maggie thought of her daughter, the innocent life growing inside her who deserved a mother strong enough to fight. "I can do it," she said. "For her, I can do anything." 3 days later, Maggie met James Thornton. James Thornton's office was nothing like Maggie expected. After hearing Diana's description of the legendary forensic accountant who had brought down senators and exposed corporate fraud rings, Maggie had imagined a gleaming corner office in a glass tower, something that matched the magnitude of his reputation. Instead, she found herself in a modest 2-room suite in a Brooklyn brownstone. The furniture was worn but comfortable. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves overflowing with financial texts. A small window overlooked a quiet, residential street where children were playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. James Thornton himself was equally surprising. At 52, he looked more like a tired professor than a financial shark. Reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, gray sweater with a small hole in the elbow, kind eyes that seemed to see right through to the heart of things. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his cluttered desk. "Diana speaks very highly of you. Please, sit." Maggie lowered herself carefully into the chair, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. James noticed and smiled gently. "When is the baby due?" "6 weeks," Maggie said. "Give or take?" He nodded, then opened a folder on his desk. "I have reviewed your husband's public financials, the ones accessible through corporate filings and public records." He looked up at her over his reading glasses. Either Richard Holloway is a criminal mastermind or his accountant is, possibly both. "Can I ask you something directly, Mrs. Holloway?" "Of course. How did you not notice he was spending $40,000 a month on what he labeled as business development?" The question hit Maggie like a slap. She felt her cheeks flush with shame. "I trusted him," she said quietly. "I did not look at the statements. I let him handle all the finances because he told me it was too complicated for me to understand." James was silent for a moment. Then he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "That was your first mistake," he said. "Do not worry. We all make it once." Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes, not from the criticism, but from the unexpected gentleness in his voice. "You sound like you are speaking from experience." James placed his glasses back on his nose and leaned back in his chair. "My sister," he said, "married to a man who seemed perfect on paper, successful, charming, adored by everyone. For 15 years, she believed she was living a fairy tale. Then she discovered he had been hiding a gambling addiction that had drained their savings, their children's college funds, and a secret line of credit in her name. When she tried to leave, he used every legal and financial weapon at his disposal to destroy her." "What happened?" James's expression hardened. She fought back. "With my help. It took 3 years and cost her almost everything, but she got out. She rebuilt her life. Her kids are in college now, paid for by the settlement we extracted from that monster." He leaned forward. "I do not take many cases anymore, Mrs. Holloway, but Diana told me your story, and I see my sister in you. A smart, capable woman who trusted the wrong man. If you are willing to fight, truly fight, I will help you." Maggie met his eyes. "I am willing." "Good. Because what I am about to tell you will be the hardest thing you have ever done." He pulled out a fresh legal pad. "I can find where Richard has hidden his money. I am very good at that. But finding it and getting it are 2 different things. If he suspects you are investigating him, he will move everything offshore where we cannot touch it. He will destroy documents, intimidate witnesses, and use every resource at his disposal to bury you. What do I have to do? You have to go home and be the perfect wife. For as long as it takes, you have to look at the man who betrayed you and smile like nothing is wrong. You have to sleep next to him, eat breakfast with him, let him touch your pregnant belly, and pretend you do not want to scream. Maggie's stomach churned. Can you do that, Mrs. Holloway? She thought about her daughter, about the life she wanted to give her child, about the woman she used to be and the woman she needed to become. Call me Maggie, she said. And yes, I can do it. James nodded slowly. Then we have work to do. He handed her a burner phone. Use this for all communication with me and Diana. Never charge it at home. Never leave it where Richard can find it. If you discover any financial documents, photograph them with this phone and send them to me immediately. Do not remove anything from his office. Do not change anything. We need him to believe everything is normal. Maggie took the phone. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the magnitude of what she was about to do. One more thing, James said. This process could take weeks, maybe months. There will be moments when you want to confront him. Moments when the pretending becomes unbearable. When that happens, I want you to remember something. What? Divorce is not about fairness, James said. It is about leverage. The person with better information wins. Stop thinking like a victim. Start thinking like the attorney you used to be. Maggie looked at the burner phone in her hand. Then she looked at James Thornton, this unlikely ally who had seen her shame and offered her hope. I spent 5 years forgetting who I was, she said. It is time I remembered. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Maggie's life. Every morning, she woke up next to Richard and felt the familiar surge of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Every evening, she prepared dinner and smiled at his jokes and asked about his day, all while knowing that he was coming from another woman's bed. The performance required every ounce of strength she possessed. Richard, for his part, seemed to notice nothing. He was distracted, often checking his phone during meals, leaving for work earlier and coming home later. When he looked at Maggie, she saw the same casual indifference that had been there for months. She had simply stopped mattering to him. She was furniture, a placeholder, a vessel carrying his air until something better came along. But Maggie was not idle. During the hours Richard was away, she photographed every document she could find. Bank statements, investment records, property deeds, and tax returns. She sent them to James Thornton on the burner phone and waited for his analysis. At night, when Richard was asleep, she talked to her daughter. I know you can feel my stress, little one, she whispered in the darkness. I am sorry, but I promise you, Mommy is going to make sure we are okay, both of us. Even if I have to burn his whole world down to do it. The baby kicked in response, and Maggie smiled despite everything. Diana called one evening while Richard was supposedly at a client dinner. How are you holding up? Diana asked, concern evident in her voice. I am surviving, Maggie said. But Diana, it is so hard. Every time he touches me, I want to scream. Every time he lies about where he has been, I want to throw the evidence in his face. I know. But you are doing incredible work. James is amazed by how much documentation you have gathered. He says you would have made an excellent investigator. I was trained as a lawyer, Maggie said. Investigation was always my favorite part of building a case. Well, your instincts are paying off. James thinks he has found something big. He wants to meet tomorrow. Can you get away? Maggie's heart raced. Richard has golf in the morning. I can meet James at 10. The next morning, Maggie sat in James Thornton's Brooklyn office, her hands trembling with anticipation. I found it, James said. His eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. Found what? A hidden account? In the Cayman Islands. Richard has been funneling money into it for almost 3 years. The current balance is just over $8 million. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. $8 million? That is not all. James leaned forward. The way he moved the money, it constitutes fraud. Specifically, he diverted funds from his company's accounts into this personal offshore account without disclosing it to his business partners or the IRS. That is called embezzlement and tax evasion. Both are federal crimes. What does that mean for me? It means we have him, James said. If you file for divorce now, his lawyers will fight dirty. But if we threaten to report his financial crimes to the FBI, he will settle immediately. A man like Richard cannot afford a federal investigation. It would destroy his business, his reputation, everything he has built. Diana arrived just then, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. James called me with the news, she said, embracing Maggie carefully around her pregnant belly. Maggie, this is huge. We have all the leverage we need. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face. Not sad tears, not anymore. These were tears of relief, of vindication, of hope. It is over, she whispered. It is finally over. Diana squeezed her hand. We should celebrate. Non-alcoholic champagne for you, real champagne for us. James, do you have any glasses? James produced 3 mismatched mugs from his desk drawer. Best I can do, he said with a rare smile. They toasted to victory, to justice, to new beginnings. That night, Maggie slept peacefully for the first time in months. She dreamed of her daughter, of the life they would build together, of the freedom that was finally within reach. She did not know that her nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, Maggie woke to find Richard sitting on the edge of the bed. His back was to her, but she could see her laptop open in his hands. The laptop she had thought was password protected. The laptop where she had carelessly saved backup copies of her communications with James. Richard turned slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes were ice. Who is James Thornton, Margaret? His voice was quiet, controlled, terrifying. And why have you been emailing him about offshore accounts? The world tilted beneath Maggie. The safety she had felt just hours ago shattered into a million pieces. He had found everything. Richard did not yell. That was what made it truly terrifying. Maggie had prepared herself for rage, for screaming, for the explosive anger she had seen him direct at subordinates and competitors. She could have handled that. She knew how to fight against fury. But this cold, controlled menace was something else entirely. Richard set the laptop on the bed between them. His movements were deliberate, almost casual, like a cat playing with a mouse it had already caught. I have to say, I am impressed, he said. I genuinely did not think you had it in you, my sweet, simple Maggie. Running around playing detective, it is almost adorable. Richard, I can explain. Please do not, he interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. I am not interested in explanations. I am interested in solutions. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had once represented everything Maggie thought she wanted. Here's what is going to happen now. You are going to delete every file on that laptop. You are going to stop communicating with James Thornton and Diana Wells. You are going to be a good wife until our daughter is born. Then, and only then, we will discuss custody arrangements. Maggie's blood ran cold. Custody? You do not even want her. You have never once touched my belly. You have never asked about her name. You do not care about this baby. Richard turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw the cruelty beneath his polished surface. I do not have to want her to use her, he said. Think about it. Joint custody, our daughter spending every other Christmas with Tiffany, every other birthday, summers at my beach house while you rot in whatever apartment you can afford on a legal secretary's salary. How does that sound? The threat hung in the air like poison. He was going to use their daughter as a weapon. The child Maggie had carried for 8 months, had talked to every night, had already fallen desperately in love with. Richard saw her only as leverage. You would not? Maggie whispered. Watch me, Richard said. His smile was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. Now, I am late for a meeting. When I get home tonight, I expect that laptop to be wiped clean and your attitude to be significantly adjusted. He picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. Oh, and Margaret? He paused without turning around. If you try anything like this again, I will not be so understanding. There are men who specialize in making custody battles very ugly for mothers who behave erratically. Postpartum depression is so common these days. It would be a shame if the court decided you were unfit. The door closed behind him. Maggie sat frozen on the bed, her hand pressed against her belly where her daughter kicked frantically as if sensing her mother's terror. Within 48 hours, Richard demolished everything Maggie had built. The first blow came that afternoon. James Thornton called on the burner phone, his voice tight with controlled anger. I have been fired, he said. Fired? From what? Your husband's company. I had a consulting relationship with Holloway Properties. Nothing major, just some quarterly audits. But this morning, I received notice that my services are no longer required. And Maggie, they cited a conflict of interest, which means Richard knows I was working with you. Oh God, it gets worse. Without that relationship, I am exposed to claims that I used proprietary information for personal purposes. Your husband's lawyers have already sent a warning letter. If I continue working on your case, they will sue me into oblivion. The second blow came that evening. Maggie tried to use her credit card to buy groceries. The transaction was declined. She tried another card, declined. Her debit card linked to their joint account. Declined when she called the bank, a sympathetic customer service representative explained that all accounts in her name had been frozen, pending a review of suspicious activity. Richard had cut her off completely. She had no money, no access to any funds. She was 8 months pregnant and could not even buy milk for her morning coffee. The third blow was the cruelest. Desperate, Maggie called her mother in Connecticut. Mom, I need help. Richard and I are having problems and I need somewhere to stay. The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. Margaret, her mother finally said, her voice strange and distant. Richard called us last night. What? He is very worried about you, sweetheart. He says the pregnancy has been affecting your mental state, that you have been paranoid, making accusations, seeing things that are not there. He asked us to encourage you to seek help. Mom, that is not true. He is lying. More silence. He sounded so sincere, Margaret, and you have been distant lately. You barely call anymore. Maybe you should consider talking to someone. He isolated me from you, Maggie shouted into the phone, tears streaming down her face. That was part of his plan. Mom, please, you have to believe me. But her mother's voice had taken on that careful, placating tone people use with unstable relatives. Just get some rest, Margaret. I am sure everything will seem clear in the morning. The line went dead. Maggie slid down the kitchen wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, the phone pressed against her chest. He had turned her own family against her, convinced them she was crazy. She was completely, utterly alone. The next morning, Diana called with the final devastating news. Maggie, I am so sorry. What now? Richard's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter threatening malpractice claims. They are alleging that I engaged in harassment and tortious interference with his business relationships. If I continue representing you, they will report me to the Bar Association. Diana, you cannot abandon me now. I am not abandoning you. Diana's voice cracked. But I cannot help you if I lose my license. I have a daughter too, Maggie. I have to protect her future. I understand, Maggie heard herself say. The words felt hollow, meaningless. I understand. After Diana hung up, Maggie sat in the empty penthouse and faced the truth. Richard had won. James was gone. Diana was gone. Her parents thought she was mentally ill. She had no money, no allies, no options. She was 8 months pregnant and completely at the mercy of a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle. For the first time since this nightmare began, Maggie allowed herself to break completely. She crawled into bed, pulled the covers over her head, and sobbed until she had nothing left. For 3 days, Maggie barely left the bedroom. She ate when she remembered, which was not often. She slept in fits and starts, waking from nightmares where Richard took her daughter, and she could not find them no matter how hard she searched. The baby kicked constantly, as if protesting her mother's despair. Richard came and went, ignoring her completely. He had won, and he knew it. He did not even bother to gloat. The cruelest part was that he had hired a nurse. Her name was Gloria, and she was supposedly there to monitor Maggie's health during the final weeks of pregnancy. But Gloria reported to Richard she noted Maggie's eating habits, her sleeping patterns, her emotional state. She was building a case, documenting evidence of an unfit mother. Maggie understood this because she had done the same thing herself, back when she was a lawyer, helping clients build custody cases. She recognized the strategy. On the 4th day, Maggie forced herself to take a shower. She stood under the hot water and spoke to her daughter, as she had done throughout her pregnancy. But this time, the words were different. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry, little one. I thought I could fight him, but he is too strong. He has too much money, too many resources, too many weapons. Maybe if I just do what he says, you will be okay. Maybe that is enough. Maybe I do not matter anymore. Just you." The baby kicked hard, almost painfully. Maggie placed her hand on her belly and felt her daughter moving inside her. This tiny person who did not know yet how cruel the world could be. This innocent life who trusted her mother to keep her safe. And suddenly, Maggie was angry. Not the helpless, weeping anger she had felt for days. This was different. This was the cold, clarifying rage of a woman who had finally reached the bottom and discovered there was nowhere left to fall. "My grandmother used to say something," Maggie said aloud, her voice steady now. "When you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to fight for." She turned off the water and looked at herself in the mirror, really looked. For the first time in months, she saw a woman who had been systematically destroyed. A woman who had lost her career, her friends, her money, her family. A woman who had been manipulated and betrayed by the man she loved. But she also saw something else. She saw Margaret Catherine Holloway, who had graduated top of her class from Columbia Law School. She saw the fierce attorney who had never lost a case she truly believed in. She saw a mother who would do anything to protect her daughter. "He wants me to be weak," Maggie said to her reflection. "Fine, let him think I am weak. But I am going to find a way to fight back. And when I do, he will never see it coming." The first thing she needed was information. Richard thought she was broken, defeated, no longer a threat, which meant he had gotten careless. Gloria reported to him in the evenings, but during the day, she mostly stayed in the guest room watching television. Maggie began to watch, to listen, to pay attention to the details she had missed before. She noticed that Richard's calendar was still synced to the iPad in the living room. An oversight, probably. He had so many devices, so many accounts, it was easy to forget to unsync one. She started checking it regularly, memorizing his schedule, noting his meetings and appointments. 3 days later, she found what she was looking for. A dinner reservation at Augustine, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. Table for 2, tomorrow night. The reservation was under Tiffany Blake's name. Maggie's mind began to work. Not the foggy, grief-stricken thinking of the past weeks, but the sharp, strategic analysis she had used to build winning cases. Richard would be at Augustine tomorrow night with his mistress. If Maggie could be there, if she could confront him publicly, it would not change the legal situation, but it would change the dynamic. Men like Richard cared about appearances above all else. His entire identity was built on projecting success and control. A public confrontation, especially one involving his pregnant wife and his mistress, would humiliate him in front of the people whose opinions he valued most. It would not give her leverage, but it might give her something to negotiate with. The problem was that Maggie had no money. She could not make a reservation at Augustine. She could not even afford the cab fare to get there. She needed help. But everyone who had tried to help her had been neutralized by Richard's lawyers. Almost everyone. Maggie thought about the people from her old life. Before Richard, before the penthouse, before she had given up everything to become his wife. There had been clients she had helped, colleagues she had worked with, contacts she had made. One name surfaced from the depths of her memory. Marcus Webb. He was a private investigator she had helped years ago. He had been accused of illegally obtaining evidence in a custody case, and Maggie had gotten the charges dismissed on a technicality. He had told her afterward that he owed her one. It had been 5 years. He probably did not even remember her. But Maggie had nothing left to lose. She found his number through an old email account Richard did not know about. Her hand shook as she dialed. Marcus Webb, Investigations, a gruff voice answered. Marcus, this is Maggie Holloway. You might remember me as Maggie Chen from the custody case 5 years ago. Silence. Then a low whistle. Maggie Chen. Holy hell, I thought you fell off the face of the earth. Last I heard, you married some rich guy and disappeared. Maggie laughed bitterly. That is one way to describe it. Listen, Marcus, I need help, and I am calling in that favor you owe me. Augustine occupied the ground floor of a Beaux-Arts building in the financial district. Its reputation for exclusivity matched only by its legendary discretion. The restaurant did not advertise. It did not accept reservations from unknown callers. Its clientele were the kind of people who shaped markets and ended political careers before breakfast. Getting a table had taken every favor Marcus Webb had accumulated over a 20-year career. He had also arranged something else, something that would give Maggie the leverage she desperately needed. Dominic Ashford, Marcus had explained when he called her back. You want to know about the Morrison case? Dominic Ashford was the forensic analyst who built the financial evidence against the senator. He worked with James Thornton behind the scenes. I remember the name, Maggie said. He testified at the trial. Yeah, well, here's what nobody knows. Ashford hates men who hurt pregnant women. Personal reasons. His sister was in an abusive relationship. She died from complications after her husband pushed her down a flight of stairs when she was 7 months pregnant. Maggie's hand went instinctively to her belly. That is awful. It is why he does what he does now, taking down powerful men who think they can get away with anything. When I told him your story, he wanted in. He agreed to meet you at Augustine tomorrow night. Meet me? Why would someone like Dominic Ashford want to help me? Because Richard Holloway's name came up during the Morrison investigation. Thornton edited him out of the final case to keep the focus on the senator. But Ashford kept the files. Your husband was not just a bystander, Maggie. He was Morrison's fixer. He laundered campaign funds through his real estate deals. Maggie's breath caught. Richard was involved with Morrison up to his neck, and Ashford has been looking for leverage to reopen that case for 3 years. The next evening, Maggie put on the red dress she had bought for her 5th wedding anniversary. Richard had told her it made her look desperate. She had never worn it again. Tonight, she thought it made her look like a woman who was done being afraid. Gloria was suspicious when Maggie said she was going out. Mr. Holloway wants you to rest, the nurse said, her tone disapproving. Holloway can discuss it with me when he gets home, Maggie replied calmly. I am going to visit a friend. I will be back in a few hours. She walked out before Gloria could object. The cab ride to Augustine felt surreal. Maggie watched the city lights blur past and tried to calm her racing heart. She had no idea if this plan would work. She was gambling everything on the word of a private investigator and the conscience of a man she had never met. But she had no other options left. The restaurant was everything she had imagined. Soft lighting, fresh flowers, the quiet hum of conversations too important for ordinary people to hear. Maggie felt underdressed despite the red dress, outclassed by the casual confidence of old money. Then she saw him. Dominic Ashford sat at a corner table, his silver hair distinguished against his charcoal suit. He was older than she expected, perhaps 60, with the bearing of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. When he saw her approaching, he stood. Mrs. Holloway, he said, taking her hand. Marcus spoke highly of you. Please sit. Maggie lowered herself carefully into the chair, painfully aware of how pregnant she looked in this room full of elegant, unencumbered people. Thank you for meeting me, she said. I know this is unusual. What your husband is doing to you is unusual, Dominic replied. Or rather, it is depressingly common, but no less unconscionable for that. I read the file Marcus sent me. I want you to know that what Richard Holloway is doing is criminal. Not just legally, morally. Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes, but refused to let them fall. I do not want pity, Mr. Ashford. I want help. Good, he said, a small smile crossing his weathered face. Because pity does not win court cases. Strategy does. He signaled a waiter and ordered sparkling water for both of them. Let me tell you what I know about your husband, he continued. Richard Holloway was deeply involved in Senator Morrison's campaign finance scheme. He used shell companies to launder donations, moving money through real estate transactions that looked legitimate on paper. When the investigation began, James Thornton made a strategic decision to focus on the senator and let the smaller players go. Smaller players? Richard was useful as a witness, not a defendant. His testimony helped convict Morrison. In exchange, his involvement was minimized in the final report. Maggie processed this. So he got away with it. At the time, yes, but I kept copies of everything. The FBI has been looking for a reason to reopen the Morrison case. They believe there are other conspirators who escaped justice. If they had evidence that Richard Holloway committed perjury or that he continued illegal activities after the trial, they could prosecute him. Dominic nodded. Your husband is not just a cheater, Mrs. Holloway. He is a federal witness with a very fragile deal. And the people he helped put in prison would be very interested to know that his cooperation was less complete than advertised. Maggie was about to respond when she saw them. Richard and Tiffany walking through the restaurant toward a table on the opposite side of the room. Tiffany was wearing a white dress that probably cost more than Maggie's entire wardrobe. Richard had his hand on the small of her back, guiding her possessively. He had not seen Maggie yet. Your husband has arrived, Dominic observed calmly. He was watching Richard's reflection in a polished silver ice bucket, and he does not look pleased. Let him see, Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. Let him understand that the rules have changed. Richard spotted her. 3 minutes later, she watched his face transform, first confusion, then recognition, then a fury so intense it seemed to radiate across the room. He leaned down and said something to Tiffany. Then he began walking toward their table. Maggie's heart was pounding, but she kept her expression serene. She picked up her water glass and took a slow sip. This is a dangerous game, Dominic murmured. I know, she replied, but I am out of safe options. Richard arrived at their table, his face a mask of controlled rage. What the hell do you think you are doing, Margaret? I am having dinner, Maggie said pleasantly, with a friend. You remember how to have dinner with a friend, do you not? Or do all your dinners involve mistresses now? Richard's jaw tightened. We will discuss this at home. No, Maggie said, and her voice was iron. We will discuss this right now. Or rather, you will listen while I explain how things are going to be from now on. Richard's eyes flicked to Dominic, dismissing him. I do not know who you are, old man, but this is a private family matter. Dominic smiled pleasantly. My name is Dominic Ashford, and I suspect you know exactly who I am. The color drained from Richard's face. That is right, Maggie said. I know about Morrison. I know about the shell companies. I know about everything you did and everything you lied about to the FBI. So here is what is going to happen. She was about to continue when she felt it. A sudden warmth between her legs, a rush of fluid. Her water had broken. In the middle of Augustine, in front of Richard and Dominic, and 50 of Manhattan's most powerful people. The baby was coming. The ambulance ride to Mount Sinai was a blur of contractions and chaos. Maggie had imagined giving birth many times during her pregnancy. She had pictured a peaceful hospital room, soft music playing, Richard holding her hand and telling her everything would be okay. She had not imagined doing it alone, timing her breathing exercises between texts to a Washington Post journalist. The contractions were coming every 4 minutes now. Each one felt like her entire body was being squeezed by a giant fist. But between them, her mind was clearer than it had been in months. She had one chance to get this right. Marcus had given her the contact information for Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist who specialized in political corruption. Maggie had worked with her years ago on a case involving municipal fraud. Now, lying in the back of an ambulance with her hospital gown soaked and her body racked with pain, Maggie typed out the most important text of her life. Sarah, this is Maggie Holloway, formerly Maggie Chen. I have documents linking Richard Holloway to the Morrison campaign finance scandal. Full story available in exchange for one condition. Story does not run until my divorce is finalized. Call me. The contraction hit just as she pressed send. Ma'am, the EMT said, looking at her phone with concern. You really should focus on breathing. Maggie gasped through the pain. I am breathing. I am also texting. Women have been multitasking since the beginning of time. When this contraction is over, please hand me my phone. I have 2 more messages to send. The EMT, a young woman with braids and kind eyes, actually laughed. You are something else, Mrs. Holloway. I am a mother, Maggie said as the contraction eased. That makes me invincible. At the hospital, everything happened quickly. A private room, monitors and IV lines, and the calm chaos of medical professionals preparing for delivery. The OB on call was a woman named Dr. Patterson who had delivered hundreds of babies and radiated competence. Your blood pressure is elevated, Dr. Patterson said, reviewing the monitors. Probably the stress. We will need to watch that closely. I have had a difficult few weeks, Maggie said. Understatement of the year, I imagine. The door opened, and Richard walked in. He had left Tiffany at the restaurant, apparently. His face was arranged into an expression of concern, but Maggie could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already thinking about optics, about how this would look to the hospital staff, about the narrative he would craft later. Sweetheart, he said, moving toward her bed. I came as soon as I heard. How are you feeling? Get out. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that stopped him in his tracks. Maggie, be reasonable. I am your husband. I am the father. I have every right to be here. Another contraction hit. Maggie breathed through it, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. When it passed, she spoke. In about 30 minutes, our daughter is going to be born. And 30 minutes after that, my contact at the FBI is going to receive a very detailed file about your involvement in the Morrison scandal. So here's what you can do, Richard. You can leave this room right now and start thinking about how you want your divorce settlement to look. Or you can stay, and I will make a phone call that ends with you in federal custody. Richard stared at her. You are bluffing. I never bluff, Maggie said. I am a lawyer. We do not bluff, we build cases. She picked up her phone and showed him the screen. Sarah Chen's response was visible. Got your message. Sources confirm. Ready to run whenever you give the word. Richard's face went white. You would not. You would destroy everything. The company, our life, your own child's inheritance. You mean the inheritance you were planning to hide in offshore accounts while giving me nothing? Maggie shook her head. I do not want your blood money, Richard. I want my freedom. I want custody of my daughter, and I want you out of my life forever. Give me those things, and the Morrison files stay buried. Fight me, and I will burn your world to the ground. The contraction came again, stronger this time. Dr. Patterson moved between them. Sir, I need you to leave. My patient needs to focus on delivering this baby, not on whatever is happening between you two. Richard looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. For the first time since she had discovered his affair, she saw fear in his eyes. This is not over, he said. No, Maggie agreed, but you should think very carefully about what comes next, because I have nothing left to lose, and you have everything. He left. Dr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. I take it the difficult weeks involved more than just pregnancy hormones. Maggie laughed, then gasped as another contraction hit. You could say that. Well, whatever is going on, it can wait. Right now, let us bring your daughter into the world. Eleanor Rose Holloway was born at 11:47 in the evening. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect pink skin and a full head of dark hair. Eyes that looked like the ocean on a cloudy day. Maggie held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her. Every wound Richard had inflicted, every scar from the past months of warfare, every moment of despair and fear suddenly seemed small compared to this overwhelming love. Hi, Eleanor, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I am your mom, and I promise you, no one is ever going to make you feel small. No one is ever going to make you give up your dreams. You are going to be strong and brave and free, because that is what I am fighting for. That is what I will always fight for. The baby yawned, her tiny fist curling around Maggie's finger. In that moment, Maggie knew that whatever came next, she had already won. The settlement papers arrived at the hospital the next morning. Richard's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Peterson, who looked like he had sold his soul decades ago, delivered them personally. He stood in the corner of Maggie's room while she nursed Eleanor, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. My client has authorized me to present a settlement offer, Peterson said. He wishes to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. I am sure he does, Maggie replied. Let me see it. The terms were more generous than she had dared to hope. Full custody of Eleanor, $12 million in liquid assets. The Manhattan penthouse to be sold with proceeds going to Maggie. Child support until Eleanor turned 25, and a provision that Richard would have supervised visitation only, subject to Maggie's approval. But there was one clause that made her pause. What is this about a non-disclosure agreement? Peterson shifted uncomfortably. My client requires your signature on an agreement preventing you from disclosing any information about his business dealings or personal life. Maggie looked at the lawyer, then she looked at Eleanor, sleeping peacefully against her chest. He is not afraid of the divorce, she said slowly. He is afraid of what I know about Morrison. Peterson said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Maggie had a choice to make. She could destroy Richard. Send the files to the FBI. Let Sarah Chen run the story. Watch as his empire crumbled and his freedom evaporated. It would be satisfying. It would be justice. But it would also mean years of trials and appeals, subpoenas and depositions, and her face splashed across every tabloid in the country. Eleanor, growing up with the man who sent Daddy to prison as her mother's defining characteristic. Sometimes revenge was not the same as victory. "I will sign," Maggie said, "but I am keeping copies of everything in a safety deposit box. If Richard ever contacts me, Eleanor, or anyone I love in any way that I find threatening, those files go to the FBI and the Post within 24 hours. Make sure he understands that." Peterson nodded stiffly. "I will convey your terms." After he left, Maggie sat alone with her daughter, watching the Manhattan skyline through the hospital window. 1 year ago, she had been a prisoner in that penthouse, isolated and manipulated by a man who saw her as property. Now she was free, battered, exhausted, but free, and she had Eleanor. "I used to think my story ended when I signed those papers," she said softly to her sleeping daughter. But that was just the beginning. 1 year later, the offices of Holloway Chen Family Law occupied the top floor of a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. The space was warm and welcoming, with comfortable furniture and soft lighting designed to put anxious clients at ease. Maggie had started the firm 6 months ago, specializing in divorce cases for women escaping controlling or abusive marriages. She charged on a sliding scale, sometimes waiving fees entirely for clients who could not afford representation. The work was hard, the hours were long, and she had never been happier. Eleanor was walking now, toddling around the office, now on chubby legs, charming everyone she encountered. Diana had come back into Maggie's life after Richard's threat of malpractice evaporated with his leverage. She was now a partner in the firm, handling the complex financial cases, while Maggie focused on custody and protection orders. James Thornton stopped by occasionally, bringing gifts for Eleanor and advice for the firm's more complicated forensic accounting needs. Marcus Webb had become their go-to investigator, his gruff demeanor hiding a soft spot for the women they helped. Even Maggie's parents had come around. After the divorce was finalized and the truth came out, they had apologized tearfully for believing Richard's lies. The reconciliation was still a work in progress, but Eleanor loved her grandparents, and that mattered more than old wounds. The last person Maggie expected to see on a quiet Tuesday afternoon was Dominic Ashford. He walked into the office, holding a bottle of wine and wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn at Augustine a lifetime ago. "Congratulations are in order," he said, handing her the bottle. "I hear the firm is doing remarkable work." "We are trying," Maggie said, "one case at a time." Dominic watched Eleanor playing with blocks in the corner. "She looks like you, strong. She is the best thing that ever happened to me." Dominic nodded slowly. "I want you to know that the FBI reopened the Morrison investigation 6 months ago. They have not contacted Richard yet, but they will. The evidence I provided was enough to justify a new look at everyone involved." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "I signed an NDA, which covers what you disclose, not what I'd disclose, and I never signed anything." He smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. "Sometimes justice takes time, but it does come eventually." After Dominic left, Maggie sat at her desk and looked around the office she had built from nothing. The diplomas on the wall, the client files stacked neatly on the shelves, the photos of Eleanor at every age. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it and felt her breath catch. "Congratulations on your practice. I hear you are helping women like me now." "I need help. He found out I am pregnant and he is furious. I do not know what to do. My name is Jennifer. My husband is Senator Morrison's son." Maggie looked at Eleanor, who was stacking blocks into a lopsided tower with fierce concentration. She looked at the text. She smiled. Looks like Mommy has work to do, sweetheart. That night, after Eleanor was asleep, Maggie sat on the fire escape of her Brooklyn apartment and watched the city lights glitter against the darkness. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, broken, defeated, convinced that she had lost everything. That woman could never have imagined this life, this freedom, this purpose. I used to think my story ended when I signed those papers, she said to no one in particular, but that was just the beginning. Every woman who walks into my office reminds me why I went through hell. Because sometimes you have to burn to learn how to rise, and sometimes you have to rise so you can help others escape the flames. Her phone buzzed again. Jennifer asking if they could meet tomorrow. Maggie typed back, "My office, 10 in the morning. Bring any documents you have. And Jennifer, I want you to know something. Whatever he has told you, whatever he has made you believe, you are not alone anymore. We are going to fight this together, and we are going to win." She pressed send. Then she went inside to kiss her sleeping daughter goodnight, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Because she was Margaret Catherine Holloway, mother, lawyer, survivor, and she was just getting started. Before we begin, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were not who you thought they were? Drop a comment below. You are not alone, and your story matters. If this channel has ever made you feel seen, understood, or simply less alone in this world, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you will never miss a story that might be exactly what you need to hear. And if you know a woman who is going through something difficult right now, share this video with her. Sometimes a story is the lifeline someone needs. Now, let us begin. Closing statement. Thank you for staying until the very end. Remember this. You are stronger than the person who hurt you. You are smarter than they gave you credit for. And your story is not over. It is just beginning. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me your thoughts. I read every single one. Like this video if you believe every woman deserves to know her worth. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And subscribe if you want more stories that remind you of your own power. Until next time, take care of yourself. You matter more than you know. Manual creation disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful storytelling with valuable life lessons. Every word was crafted with intention, every scene designed to inspire and empower. We believe stories have the power to heal, to teach, and to transform. Thank you for trusting us with your time.